Throughout slavery, enslaved individuals endured brutal and unethical studies led by those with malicious intent. It's imperative for us to pay attention to the many clues in Scripture to discern who they are, their motives, and their methods. This understanding is vital for safeguarding ourselves against potential harm and deception. To get started, let's just highlight some of the wicked and unethical treatments used against our people, and then we'll talk about certain ones in detail. Between 1845 and 1849, J. Marion Sims conducted gynecological experiments on enslaved women. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932 and continued until 1972. We're talking about 40 years, family. In the 1940s, they did mustard gas testing on black soldiers, and between 1950 and 1970, they conducted the Holmesburg prison experiments. In the 1950s, the United States military sprayed chemicals in a black St. Louis neighborhood. In 1951, they took the cells of Henrietta Lacks without her consent. In the 1990s, they did an aggression study on black children, and in the 20th century, there was the forced sterilization of black women. And of course, we know that there are many more. There are things that we still don't know about. But when we look at who's behind these evil deeds, it points to the seed of the serpent. It stems from the ancient hatred, the enmity that began in the Garden of Eden to kill, steal, and destroy. Let's do a quick summary of the Tuskegee study for those who may not know about it. This comes from McGill Office of Science and Society, entitled 40 Years of Human Experimentation in America. It says the goal was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in black populations, but the subjects were completely unaware and were instead told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, when in fact they received no treatment at all. So starting in 1932, 600 African American men from Macon County, Alabama, were enlisted to partake in a scientific experiment on syphilis. The study was conducted by the United States Public Health Service. Now, what reason did they give for doing this? Well, during and after the Civil War, it was argued that African Americans were a different species from white Americans, and mixed race children were presumed prone to medical issues. The glaring question here is, where did those mixed race children come from? Not only that, doctors during that era testified that the emancipation of the slaves had caused the mental, moral, and physical deterioration of the black population, saying that the slaves were virtually free of disease when they were slaves. But after emancipation, they were overwhelmed by it. Many believed that the African Americans were doomed to extinction, and arguments were made about their physiology being unsuited for the colder climates of America. So they wanted to return them to Africa. Now just think about this. After holding them in slavery for centuries, they suddenly realized that they were better suited to the climate in Africa. Then why didn't they send them back? Because there was still money to be made. But listen to how the heathens rationalized this experiment. They said the scientific and medical authorities believed that while the brains of African Americans were under-evolved, their genitals were overdeveloped. Interesting that it wasn't a problem when they were working them on the plantations and forcing them to breed. But now they're going to give the real reason for the experiment. It says black men were seen to have an intrinsic perversion for white women, and all African Americans were seen as inherently immoral with insatiable sexual appetites. So they conveniently ignored how they were forcing them to breed. So at first, they couldn't get enough people to participate in the experiment because the men thought it was a trick to get them to join the military. To erase those fears, they began examining women and children as well. Men diagnosed with syphilis who were of the appropriate age were recruited for the study, while others received proper treatments. The truth is, modern medicine has deep roots in historical medical experimentation on our people. Do you know what's never talked about regarding the study? How did they get syphilis in the first place? Well, let's dig a little deeper and we'll come back to this. Now let's look at some information from HuffPost. It says in 1932, coincidentally, during Adolf Hitler's political ascent, in the decade before World War II, the United States Public Health Service commissioned a study to gain a greater understanding of syphilis. Why? Because syphilis had plagued the continent of Europe for 500 years. Just pause and think on that. 500 years. It caused madness, disfigurement, and death in countless millions. The disease is caused by Treponema pallidum, a rare type of bacterium called spirochete that swims like a water serpent and uses its unique spiral shape to drill through human tissues. Are your alarm bells going off? It swims like a water serpent? And now we need to ask, where did the Europeans get it from? Let's find out. This article is from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. It's a report from Nature Journal regarding syphilis and Neanderthal man. When they studied the skeletal remains of Neanderthals, they discovered some bone changes. They thought rickets had caused it, but they discovered that the changes were similar to those seen in certain treponemal diseases, the same disease found in those with congenital syphilis. It says when they examined the Neanderthal collection at the British Museum, they found several features compatible with this disease. Imagine that. They got it from their hybrid ancestors, and they passed it on to the enslaved people. It happened when they forced themselves on them. And let's remember that they did that to the men, women, and children. So instead of experimenting on our people, they should have been conducting experiments on themselves. Let's go back to the McGill article. It says multiple times throughout the experiment, researchers actively worked to ensure that their subjects did not receive treatment. So you're seeing how depraved some of these people are. They knew how to treat it, but they prevented them from getting it. It says in 1940, they did the same with the Alabama Health Department. In 1941, many of the men were drafted, and when it was discovered that they had syphilis, the researchers had the men removed from the Army rather than let them receive treatment. I need you to see the evil component behind this. It goes on to say that it was in these moments that the Tuskegee study's true nature became clear. Rather than simply observing and documenting the natural progression of syphilis in the community as had been planned, the researchers intervened first by telling the participants that they were being treated. So they lied to them. And then they prevented them from seeking treatment that could save their lives. Family, this is demonic. This is the ancient hatred, enmity that began in the garden. It wasn't until a whistleblower leaked information about the study to the New York Times, and then the paper published it on the front page on November 16, 1972, that the study finally ended. By that time, only 74 of the test subjects were still alive. 128 had died of syphilis or its complications. 40 of the wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had acquired congenital syphilis. Who was responsible for doing this to those people? The seed of the serpent. No need to sugarcoat it. Now let's talk about James Marion Sims. He's known as the father of modern gynecology. And how did he get that distinction? By performing experiments on enslaved women. This says few medical doctors have been as lauded and loathed as James Marion Sims. Credited as the father of modern gynecology, Sims developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to women's reproductive health. His research was conducted on enslaved black women without anesthesia. This man experimented on them and did not give them anesthesia, you all. Critics say Sims cared more about the experiments than in providing therapeutic treatment, and that he caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that black people did not feel pain. Did they really think that we didn't feel pain? Or is it that they didn't care that we felt pain? This is called sadistic personality disorder. People like that take pleasure in watching others suffer, whether by witnessing it or causing it. Individuals with this condition exhibit hostility, lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, and a fascination for violence. Who are we talking about? It's the seed of the serpent. Today, we know the names of the female fistula patients from Sims' own records: Lucy, Arnaka, and Betsy. The first one he operated on was only 18 years old. Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming, crying out in pain, as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. Listen to what this beast had to say later. He said her agony was extreme. She became extremely ill, and she contracted blood poisoning. He thought she was going to die. You don't treat animals this way. Let's go on. It says for a long time his surgeries were not successful. After 30 operations on one woman, Anarcha, he finally perfected his method. You all, he operated on one woman 30 times. After this, he began to practice on white women using anesthesia. It says while some doctors didn't trust anesthesia, Sims' decision to not use it or any other numbing technique was based on his misguided belief that black people didn't experience pain like white people did. I don't think it was misguided at all. It was intentional. This sicko also experimented on children. It says he tested surgical treatments on enslaved black children in an effort to treat neonatal tetanus with little to no success. Sims also believed that African Americans were less intelligent than white people and thought it was because their skulls grew too quickly around their brain. So he would operate on the children using a shoemaker's tool to pry their bones apart and loosen their skulls. When any of his patients succumbed to the procedures, he would blame the mothers or the black midwives. He didn't believe anything was wrong with his methods. So yes, our people had to endure the horrors of medical experimentation as well. This is the history they don't want us to know about. Let's look at this from African Elements. It's entitled The Gruesome History of Medical Experimentation on Enslaved Black People and Its Impact on American Medicine. It says medical practitioners who traveled to other countries to receive formal education established the first medical school in the United States in 1765. Slavery in the American South flourished in the 1830s alongside the establishment of medical schools. Medical students fuel the need for human bodies for teaching and testing. Slave bodies were exploited in these institutions for dissections, anatomy classes, and clinical experiments. By 1809, Dr. Ephraim McDowell, known as the father of ovariotomy, developed a method for removing ovarian tumors after acquiring and experimenting on enslaved black women. One observer wrote, "All of the women operated upon in Kentucky, except for one, were negresses, and they will bear cutting with nearly, if not quite as much impunity as dogs and rabbits." Our wonder was lessened since physicians understood that black women's propensity to handle pain was effortless. The story about Henrietta Lacks is another one that's well known, but I'll share a snippet on her for those who may not have heard of her. So she had cervical cancer, and the doctors wanted to study her cells. She refused, but they took the cells anyway, without her consent and against the expressed wishes of her husband. So this information comes from biography.com. It says, latest news, family of Henrietta Lacks settles suit over harvested cells. On August 1st, the estate of Henrietta Lacks settled its lawsuit against a Massachusetts biotech company. In a 2021 complaint, Lacks' family accused Thermo Fisher Scientific Inc. of profiting from the Hella cell line, named after the black mother of 5 whose tissue was harvested without her knowledge or consent while she was being treated for cervical cancer. The terms of the settlement are confidential. You should also know that her cells were crucial for the development of vaccines for polio, HPV, and COVID-19. And it has generated billions in profits for the life sciences industry. Not millions, billions. Have you thought about how much money they've made? How they've been profiting from these experiments as a result of using our people as guinea pigs? This information comes from the National Institute for African American Health. It's entitled How Black Slaves Were Routinely Sold as Specimens to Ambitious White Doctors. The article says there is a rich and rapidly expanding scholarly literature examining the history of human subject research, including studies of the burgeoning biomedical economy in the U.S. in the 20th century. the Tuskegee experiment, and other episodes of medical racism all feature prominently. The history of the acquisition and exploitation of slave bodies for medical education and research in the United States, first explored in depth by historians James Breeden and Todd Savitt, focused primarily on medical schools and the traffic in slave bodies in Virginia. Savitt's work drew attention to professional medicine's use of slaves in classrooms and bedside demonstrations, in operating amphitheaters and experimental facilities. It says Savitt argued that African Americans were easy targets for ambitious and entrepreneurial white physicians in the slave South. Slaves, as human commodities, were readily transformed into a medical resource, easily accessible as empirical test subjects, voiceless, and rendered medically incompetent through the combined power and authority of the enslaver and their employee, the white physician. Savitt suggested that outright experimentation upon living humans may have occurred more openly and perhaps more often owing to the nature of slave society, and also that the situation may have been, and probably was, worse in the Deep South. When an elite white enslaver physician, Charlestonian Elias S. Bennett, published notes recalling the case of a truly extraordinary tumor afflicting a young female slave on the family's James Island plantation, his narrative revealed much about the opportunities for human subject research under American slavery. Bennett recalled an unnamed female patient subject who had developed a small tumor the size of a 10-cent piece behind her right ear when she was just 4 weeks old. In 1817, when Bennett was training to become a doctor and anxious to perform an operation, he, together with a fellow physician apprentice, made a disastrously crude surgical attempt to explore and remove this growth. In an era prior to anesthesia and asepsis, this type of surgical intervention was extremely dangerous, especially when undertaken by two unsupervised medical apprentices who took liberty of an opportunity presented by an extremely vulnerable enslaved child. As Bennett remembered, the child suffered a great deal of inflammation as a result, and only by very close attention did she recover in 6 to 8 weeks. The plantation labor camp seclusion providing perfect cover for what would prove to be a major medical blunder. Bennett's crude interference with the tumor, which may have been a lymph node, was the cause of a severe inflammatory reaction and sudden excessive growth of the lesion. In 1821, when the child was 6, Bennett described the tumor as being about the size of an ostrich egg, while in the years immediately prior to her death, his narrative reported that the tumor increased to an enormous, indeed extraordinary size. The case report concludes with a post-mortem analysis, or as Bennett noted in a ghoulish tone, an imperfect outline of the results furnished by the examination of the tumor. When I obtained the head, or at least so much of it as remained. Listen to this. All of the key training, networks, and power bases of Southern medicine, apprenticeships, private practice, colleges, hospitals, journals, and societies operated through slavery's ruthless traffic and exploitation of black bodies. White medical students, as a matter of course, expected education and training based on the observation, dissection, and experimental treatment of black bodies. White doctors, including those in remote rural locations, routinely sent reports of experiments on slave subjects to medical journals and trafficked black bodies to medical colleges. Medical museums openly solicited black body parts, and medical societies relied on black bodies. Students, too, wrote graduating theses based on the medical manipulation of black subjects and specimens. Under slavery, there was also an extensive network of specialists, Negro hospitals. The grimiest of slavery's institutions, these hospitals were often sites of risky medical research and were closely linked to Negro traders anxious to patch up their stock for sale. Large numbers of individual doctors routinely advertised in Southern newspapers that they would pay cash for black people suffering from chronic disease. The fate of these trafficked medical subjects, of course, assumed the very worst possibilities. Slaves were generally unable to prevent treatments chosen by their owners, and physicians could take enormous risks with the lives of these patients. Those risks were all the greater when doctors were also the owners of the enslaved patients. The opportunities presented by the system of chattel slavery meant that white doctors had at hand an easily accessible population upon which they could execute experimental research programs and develop new tools, techniques, and medicines. White racist attitudes, the enormous traffic in human chattel, and the slave regime rationalized and normalized the use and abuse of black bodies. Human subject research under American slavery was ultimately nothing unusual. In the context of a society defined by dehumanization, impoverishment, violent punishment, incarceration, a vigorous trade in human property, racialization, and sexual interference, it should come as no surprise that human experimentation and the exploitation of enslaved bodies was a frequent, widespread, and indeed commonplace feature of medical encounters between physicians and slaves. That was the culture of American slavery, and everyday slave patients faced appalling dangers. Do we still face appalling dangers today? They would say no. But even now, our people are being subjected to cruel medical studies and experimentation. A report came out that the CDC tried to cover up information about the MMR vaccine. Listen to this. It says CDC has destroyed evidence that black boys are more than 3 times more likely to develop autism if they receive the MMR vaccine before age 3. In August of 2014, CDC senior vaccine safety scientist Dr. William Thompson invoked federal whistleblower status and testified to Congressman William Posey that his vaccine branch supervisors had ordered him and other scientists to destroy data showing that black children were suffering disproportional harm by the MMR vaccine. Dr. Thompson issued a press release through his attorney stating, "I regret that my co-authors and I omitted statistically significant information in our 2004 article published in the journal Pediatrics. The omitted data suggested that African American males who received the MMR vaccine before age 36 months were at increased risk for autism. Dr. Thompson has handed Congress thousands of pages of documents showing widespread fraud in CDC's vaccine division. What else did they find? A study by a prestigious team of Scandinavian scientists found that the DTP shot, while protecting African children from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, was wreaking havoc with their immune systems. Those children were dying at up to 10 times the rate of those who had not received it. And let's be clear, it wasn't just the medical profession. They were exploiting our people in many ways. This information is from the CDC. It's talking about unfair and unjust practices and conditions harm African American people and drive health disparities. It says the tobacco industry targets African American communities with marketing and advertising. The companies promote flavored products, especially menthol, in neighborhoods where African American people live. They profit from this. But what's the effect on us, family? We all know that tobacco use is bad for your health. So we see that they're also making money by getting our people hooked on tobacco. This information is also from the CDC. It says smoking cigarettes puts you at risk for heart disease, cancer, and stroke, which are among the leading causes of death for African American adults in the United States. About 1 in 8, or 11% of our people, are affected by this. Now add the effects of drugs and alcohol. Do you not see that they still see us as a commodity? Pushing these things on us is making them rich on one hand, and on the other, it's reducing our numbers. It's a win-win situation for those who hate us. Why are they doing these things? It's because they think they can. They've been getting away with it for centuries, using our people as guinea pigs and doing vile things with little accountability for it. But we have to stop thinking that this is just about skin color. Let me remind you who we're dealing with here. Look at this from Deuteronomy 28:49 through 50. The Most High said, I will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly nor show favor to the young. It was because of our rebellion and refusal to obey the Most High that He said He would bring a nation against us from afar. Where did they come from? The end of the earth, the land in the north. And we talked about the land in the north when we did the series on the maps. So check out the playlist if you have not heard those messages. But they display a pattern of behavior that's been consistent when they interact with our people. These are markers to help you identify the serpent seed and avoid being deceived. You know the saying, when people show you who they are, believe them. We should take heed to that advice. Our people need to wake up and understand what's really behind this intense hatred towards us. It's not natural. It's evil. And can I just tell you that no matter how hard our people try to be the perfect little Americans, it's not going to work. Their hatred is inherent. It runs deep. This has everything to do with our bloodline. If you have not listened to the last 3 live sessions, you really need to watch those videos. I'll leave links in the description. But stop listening to these folks telling you that this country is not racist. Only a truly deceived person believes that. So we'll end it here. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please hit like and the hype button and share the message. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.